You're listening to Ship Fam. On today's episode, Luke talks about the solar eclipse, quitting his job at Tonal, and the Waffle House experiment that he's currently running with his new exercise app, Thenics Pro. Listen for an inside look on everything from ASO to tech yuppie personal finances. And don't forget to like and review us wherever you get your podcasts, as well as tweet about the show.
So something really crazy happened yesterday. I went to go see the eclipse, the April 8th eclipse. And I was super lucky because we're only about an hour. Well, actually, we're only 45 minutes south of the totality path. But we wanted to get closer to the center of the totality path just to get a better experience. And so we were able to drive like an hour and a half north. It was a really quick trip. I just kind of want to go through it because it's actually a pretty amazing experience. And one thing I want to note before this is like the day before the eclipse, some guy on Twitter posted this like super negative thing about how people were getting excited about the eclipse.
Yeah.
And I responded and I said something along the lines of, I just think it's really cool when people get excited. And that tweet went like mega viral. I think it did like 2.6 million views or something like that. It was like really, really crazy. Did you see how far that thing went?
Yeah, it was insane. I was checking in from time to time. I mean, the part that I thought the funniest, it wasn't all of them. I went and checked again, but the first time I skimmed through your quote retweets that people gave you, it was all just totally harebrained political stuff. Some of it left-coded, some of it right-coded, but all super conspiratorial. And that to me was like, not to detract from the positivity of the whole tweet, because it was a cool tweet. And it was awesome that it went viral. But it's like, man, outside of our cute little build-in public bubble, Twitter's kind of a madhouse.
Yeah, it is kind of a madhouse. Yeah, there's a large group of people there who just thrive off of getting upset about like other people enjoying things, which I thought was really fascinating. I didn't even know that was like a lifestyle choice that people made, but apparently it is.
Hey, I love to get mad at people for having fun. I'm a big anti-fun guy.
One thing I want to talk about that tweet, though, before I go into the eclipse, which is kind of interesting, is that when I first put it out, it was available overnight. And I've heard people say they had the same experience with viral tweets on Twitter. It was out overnight and it was getting a couple likes. Nothing really crazy was happening. And then when I woke up in the morning, it started getting more likes. It started getting a little wider reach. And then it ratcheted up into like full blown like hype mode. And it really felt like, I don't know how they have it architected on the back end, but it really felt like there was 3 distinct levels and it was like a step function. It was almost like when it got to that high point, it was just like mainlining it into USA Twitter. That's really what it felt like.
Yeah. I mean, I could see there being pretty binary decisions in the algorithm. Like, okay, we're going to promote to your immediate followers, and then the tweet does really strong numbers, and then they might decide, okay, we're going to promote to second order, and just by the nature of just how many exponential connections there are, that's going to feel like a ramp up, and then you get the final ramp up of, okay, this is relevant to everybody in the US, and it's pulling strong numbers, we're going to promote it to everybody in the US. So, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if it is granular as it feels.
Yeah. No, that was really interesting. So the next thing I want to talk about is the actual eclipse, because that tweet was like leading up to the eclipse. And then we decided to go see it. We were in the totality path. And I just kind of want to go through the timeline on that. Have you ever seen like a complete solar eclipse before?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so I'll just walk through it. So at about T-minus 10 minutes, everything around just kind of started to get dim. But what was really crazy, like dim, like the sun was setting, right? But what was crazy is all of the colors were still that like high noon blue. And one thing I want to mention is that we had like a perfect bluebird sky. There wasn't a single cloud in the sky. So we were very lucky in that sense. But like everything started to dim down, but everything looked like normal, like blue light, like 5,000 Kelvin, 6,000 Kelvin, high noon light. And then the temperature started to drop. It was an unseasonably warm day. So we've had like a bunch of 35 degree Fahrenheit days. It's I think around 5 Celsius. And then we had like a 66 degree Fahrenheit day for this event. It was really bizarre, like how the weather like all lined up. But it was about 66 degrees. And then all of a sudden the temp dropped like 10 degrees Fahrenheit, like almost instantly. And I think it was just because of the solar gain was being reduced by the moon, like occluding the sun.
Yeah, you're losing radiative heat, right?
Exactly. And then what was really wild is that about T-minus 5 minutes, it was so dim that you could tell it was like not quite twilight dim, but getting there. But again, it was still that normal like 6,000 Kelvin blue noon light. So it kind of tricked your senses a little bit into thinking that it was still noon. But what was really crazy is a car drove by, and you know how cars now, they automatically turn on their headlights depending on how dim it is. So the car had turned on the headlights automatically, and they were like bright. They were on low beams, and they were like insanely bright, and you could see the light casting on the surface of the road, and it just looked totally bizarre. It was like somebody took nighttime photography and then just cranked up the exposure to something that like doesn't even look like real. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I could almost imagine like taking it from the other direction, like bad day for night filmography in like a cheap B movie. Maybe it could look something like that.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing that was really crazy is because the sun was still high in the sky, all the shadows were really short and crisp. But because it was so dim, all of a sudden those areas that had like shadow and then right next to it would be like a sunny spot, there was so little difference in the brightness that it looked like HDR photography. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Huh.
So that was really crazy. So then around T-minus 2 minutes, one side of the horizon turned into like a deep indigo purple blue, and then the opposite side turned into this really bizarre like snow white color. All the animals in the area got really quiet, and then at totality, I mean, it took like 10 seconds for it to transition. It was really wild. Like it was like somebody turned the dimmer down in about 10 to 15 seconds. Everything got twilight dark, you know, like right after sunset, twilight dark. And then you could see the actual sun with the naked eye. It was like this impossibly thin and bright halo. And it's kind of hard to describe because when you see pictures of it, a lot of times people have like these big like cropped photos so you can only see the eclipse, but you don't really fully understand it until you see it in like a landscape photography. And most landscape photography, I think they have the camera lens stopped down so much so that the actual moon looks really, really tiny in the picture. But I actually found a good picture online. I went through like 1,000 pictures trying to find a good representation of it. I could only find one. It's this guy who did photography in Wyoming during one of the solar eclipses. And what it really looks like is this hairline thin band around the outside edge. And it's like impossibly bright. And I have a slight astigmatism. So what it did for me is it like actually created this really crazy like set of double squiggly lines around it. It kind of looked like a double helix going around the outside edge. It wasn't until I put on my glasses that I could tell that it was like a very crisp, clean, like ring, I guess you'd call it. But no, it's just really incredible. And at that time, everybody, I mean, we were around maybe 50 other people, and you could tell that the people were just really struck and in awe of what they were seeing. And for us, it lasted about 2 minutes, and then it just did the exact same process in reverse. And at that time, we decided to take off because we were in a part of the world where there was really only one road to get in and out, and we knew that it was just going to get slammed with people. Yeah, exactly. But it was pretty incredible. So the people who haven't seen it before, like, definitely worth it to see it once. I would love to see it again, but yeah, pretty incredible stuff.
Yeah, I missed out. I'm still over here in Europe. Though I guess you have some pretty other big news too. You're not working at Tonal anymore.
Yeah, no, that's true. So just the other day, like Mike Rydstrom on Twitter, he was like, "Hey, are you still working at Tonal? Like you're doing all this building public stuff?" And the answer is, yeah, I can officially announce now that no, I'm no longer working at Tonal. People have asked me why I'm not working there anymore. And the short version is that the company I left was not the company I joined. And I understand that companies change and like you want a company to change. But I would say in this case, it did not change for the better. And I was just getting to the point where I was just so tired all the time. And it was time for me to take a break and find something else to do. And I decided to give myself minimum 6 months, maximum 12 months to work on my own things, to learn some new things. And there's a couple of things I want to say about that. First of all, in the off chance that Max Lapidus is listening to this, he was my manager when I first joined Tonal, and he gave me the opportunity to join. And for me, that was definitely like a life-changing opportunity. And he was the best manager I ever had. So I just want to thank him for that. But the other thing I want to say is I had been thinking about leaving for about a year. And the way I was handling that is I kept telling myself, so as long as I'm learning something new, as long as I'm continuously learning, then I'll stay at Tonal is the way I was framing it.
Yeah.
Right. I wasn't framing it in terms of compensation. And at first it was things like learning how to operate in a super high growth startup that had just recently got a funding round at over $1 billion. So that was pretty cool. Learning how to go through the hiring process of that, because we hired 2 people on our team of 3 while we were there. So we almost doubled our mobile team size, which it's not a lot of hires, but for what we were doing, it was significant. Just learning how to work in a really high pace, really competitive environment. But then it started to turn to things like learning how to survive the 4th round of layoffs. And it was just starting to get like pretty weird. And so after a while, I was just like, it was actually funny. The first time I went through layoffs, I was like, okay, I'm going to learn how to go through layoffs the first time. Like, I'm genuinely learning something here. And then the second time I was like, I don't know how much more I'm learning the second time. And then the third time I was like, well, I'm definitely not really learning anything new at this point. And so then it started to become like pretty clear that I wasn't really learning anything. And so it was about time for me to go. One thing I do want to say about that is that this guy on Twitter, his name is Vic, and I believe his last name is Vijay Kumar. So if I pronounce that wrong, I apologize. But he had this really interesting tweet that went semi-viral that essentially said something along the lines of the worst income to have is between, I think he said $180,000 and $250,000 a year, because you're not making enough to become financially independent, but you're making so much that it's almost impossible to say no to anything your employer asks you to do. And this has been referred to previously as golden handcuffs. And I just want to say that is definitely, it's so weird because it's definitely a real thing. I was in that range. And if I had heard myself say that like 4 years prior, I would have been like, wow, you are such an entitled prick, right? Like to say something like such an entitled thing to say. But it's definitely a real thing. I do believe that salary range is like the most soul-sucking salary range, because especially if you're remote like I am, living in a place like Bangor, Maine, which is like for all intents and purposes the middle of nowhere. When you're in that salary range, like you pretty much will do whatever somebody asks you to do. And it's really, really hard to say no to that salary and like take a chance and leave.
Yeah. On the upside, though, and this really depends a lot on personal finances, but at least for me, I kind of walked away from that range. My last job was cruise automation 4.5 years ago now. But before that was Google, and it was about the same salary range, around 200K. And 200K, that's total comp. And the crazy part is now I've spent the last nearly 5 years not meaningfully employed, and I've only just recently started making non-zero income off my indie projects, and I still have at least a year of runway left.
Yeah.
And I'm not
that's a good point.
I'm not trying to live cheap. Like right now I'm in Vienna. I just screwed off to Vienna for 3 months to just hang out, go to fancy restaurants, stuff like that. So I'm not really trying to live that cheap. And I still have I walked away from cruise with about 6 years worth of runway.
Yeah.
It's insane. It's crazy. I think it's kind of hard to get over that psychological hump of I have no cash flow in, only have cash flow out. Yep. But depending on your living expenses, of course, everything changes if you have a family or like a pretty heavy house payment. But if you just do the math, you can live off those savings for so much longer than you'd expect. But it is kind of emotionally hard to get over that. And it really depends on your whole life trajectory of how much you need to be saving to hit the milestones you're looking to hit. For me, my life trajectory is, hell, I don't know. So easy enough
exactly.
for me.
But so every option is ahead of you.
Yeah. But the term I throw at my friend a lot, he's making like 300 total comp at Waymo, and his parents are pretty loaded too, so it's a bit morbid to think about. But in the like multi-decade span, he stands to inherit deep into the millions. Yeah. And for him, he's super, super cheap. Like every restaurant we go to, he complains about the price, blah, blah, blah. And the phrase I really like to tell him is like, dude, you have operationally infinite money.
Yeah, right.
Like,
exactly.
you don't need to be cheap. For all intents and purposes, you have infinite money.
Yeah.
And I think that donut hole...
He has what you describe as like wealth, right?
Yes. Yeah. And then
Not directly, but he will have it almost guaranteed.
Yeah.
And he's got like his own savings and income.
Yeah.
So he's already building wealth on top of that.
Yeah, and he's firing on all cylinders because he's making 300 total comp. And he's been making on the order of like 200 to 300 total comp for the last decade. And not living that expensive. I mean, he's in San Francisco, so sure, that costs some bucks. But people forget just how high tech total comp in the Bay is. Even with cost of living, your income dwarfs that unless you're just somehow hemorrhaging money. Now, it is possible to pretty seriously hemorrhage money. I won't give that many personal details because he probably doesn't want to be named. But I've got a buddy making 900 total comp. And I haven't gotten to the details of his personal finance because, of course, that's a little bit private. And he hasn't fully shared with me. But he says he has trouble making that work.
Yeah. The whole topic of like, it's almost like time. It's like, what is this saying? It's work expands to fit the time allotted or something like that. It's like budget expands to fit the salary allotted or something like that.
Yeah.
That said, I will say that we really upgraded our lifestyle when I started working at Tonal. So our monthly expenses, I think 3x'd after that period of time. But what's interesting is that even so, I was saving about 70% of my paycheck during that time. Because what I found, and I've heard people say this before, is like, you know, you can upgrade, like, for example, we upgraded our house. We upgraded where we were living. We were renting a place before, then we ended up buying a place, right? And we didn't buy like crazy expensive, but we also didn't buy like super cheap either. You know, I think we did a pretty good job of hitting right in the middle. So that upgraded. But then other than that, my lifestyle hasn't changed that much. So I have money going into like a personal account for personal spending, and it's just been like ratcheting up. And I thought for sure, I was like, oh, I'll give myself more money like to spend on my personal stuff. I just never spend it, right? It's like that part of my spending is almost like deeply ingrained. And it's not like a fear related thing. It's purely just, I like working on stuff. I don't spend a lot of time buying stuff. Like that's just the way my brain works.
Yeah. I honestly find it hard to burn a lot of money. And I think there are ways to change that. I think your lifestyle expands to meet your budget really depends on the person's psychology. For example, I grew up in a household where eating out was a very big deal. And going out to a restaurant or something like that was maybe like a once in a month thing. And even then, like the nice restaurant was just some local place in my dumpy hometown that was, to be honest, kind of a shithole. A beautiful shithole, but a shithole. And had not great restaurants that were all dirt cheap. It took me a good 5 years after high school, maybe even more than that, to be comfortable just going to nice restaurants regularly.
Yeah, right.
And that was long after I was sitting on the kind of cash to be able to do that. And even now, I'll go to a nice coffee shop every day pretty regularly. I'll go to a decent restaurant and drop $50. Maybe once every other month, I'll drop maybe about 100 on a really fancy place with some friends or something like that. But even compared to that 200 total comp, which I haven't even been making in 5 years, that's not that much money. I think the places you can really start burning money is a very nice house, a very nice car, dating. Yeah. If you're taking dates to really fancy restaurants, then you're really going to burn your cash. But honestly, if you're taking a date to an ordinary restaurant, then you're going to be fine.
Dude, if I'd had that income when I was 25, my dating budget would have been unbelievably high. It just would be it would make the average person blush for sure.
I mean, the nice thing is I feel like the dating apps are dead and the dating scene is getting so rough in places like SF that sure, you can plan on spending a couple $100 per dinner, but hey, how many dinners are you actually going to get lined up?
That could be. So yeah, that gets to my personal runway, which I think because I was saving so much, I did some quick math and I can do it again right now. I'm not going to do it out loud, but let's just say I think I have about 6 years of runway. Obviously, I'm not going to use all 6. That's silly. But 6 months to 12 months as a general ballpark of what I want to put into this thing before I just throw my hands up, I think is about right. The other thing that's cool is that because I'm building consumer mobile apps, these things compound over time. So let's say I build like 3 or 4 mobile apps. Let's say I get them each to, 2K MRR, right? So 6K MRR. That doesn't get close to replacing my other salary. But then let's say I go and get another job, like that 6K MRR, that's still there, right? Yeah. And that's still compounding. So I'm getting a chance to take some time, work on the stuff that I want to work on. And one of the things that I have been working on, which we can talk about here in this next segment, is design. So when I was working as a software engineer for Tonal, I did not have the headspace to take on learning something new like design. And when I started working on Thenics Pro, I, preceded that work with about a month of light design practice. And, I'm still learning. I'm not the world's greatest designer, but the amount of leveling up I did in about 3 weeks was pretty remarkable. And we could honestly probably do an entire podcast on just front-end engineers learning design.
Yeah. I mean, I love stepping out of the front-end engineer strict box of design's not your issue. You just build to the mock-up spec. I think there's a lot of power in having an engineer that has good design sense, because every time there's a boundary between individuals, even within a single org, but especially across orgs, that's a huge friction point. So I've kind of been of the hot take for a while, and maybe this is just because, to be honest, I haven't gotten along well with designers in my past jobs. Gotten along with them great on a social level, so I've always had this weird dichotomy where we get along great, we have beers, we love each other, but then it comes down to actually getting a feature done, and we just really struggle to see eye to eye professionally. I kind of like the idea of no design teams, where the front-end engineers are pretty design heavy. I love my designers here, but maybe they should be firing their designers and hiring front-end engineers with those skills, or teaching their front-end designers engineering. I think Flutter it lowers that barrier of entry pretty massively to a degree that you could see a lot more front-end engineers learning design and vice versa, designers learning front-end engineering, and making the entire vertical a lot blurrier than it is now.
Yeah, it's interesting because front-end engineering, once you add front-end and back-end together, you get a full-stack engineer. And that like one brain, 2 roles thing ends up being really nice in that case because, as you know, like coming up with contracts, like back-end contracts and implementing them in front-end and trying to like do that collaboration, like it's not a huge ask to have a front engineer like get some basic back-end experience. Once you have those 2 things in the same brain, I mean, I think it's like 10 times faster, to be honest with you. As compared to having 2 individuals. Now, you don't get the same deep experience. So there are cases where you do want that deep back-end experience or deep front-end experience. But getting everything into one brain is super useful. And what's interesting about design is if you're already a front-end engineer, you've already built like 99% of what a designer is ever going to give you. But so when it comes to learning design, the path for a front-end engineer to actually learn design is a lot shorter than I think people realize that it is. But I think the thing that's really tough about it is front-end engineers, they're engineers. They work with constraints. Like that's their whole purpose, is to handle constraints and complexity. And design is often viewed as more of like a creative endeavor. I remember I was talking to somebody in college, and I remember saying to them that I felt like engineers worked really well with tight constraints and artists worked really well with loose constraints. And they both have like a hard time, like kind of bridging over into the other realm. But what's interesting about UI design and UX design in 2024 is that there are individuals out there who teach like a rules-oriented system around design to kind of like get you started, right? And we'll put in the show notes one of them, but there's this website called hype4.academy. I want to make sure I'm getting that right. Yeah, it's hype4.academy. And the guy who's running it, I would say the best thing about the person who's running this and hype4.academy is that they just have these really opinionated starter kits. So they're like, okay, you're doing a mobile app. Here are the 4 fonts that you need. Okay, here's 12 colors you can pick from for your primary color. Like Thenics Pro started from this idea of daily calisthenics challenges. So I was like, okay, you're going to do that like sunrise salutations in yoga. You're going to do them every morning. And I was like, okay, sunrise is usually orange. Let's use orange, right? And so then I started with orange, and then I just kind of went through the whole thing. And
Yeah.
it can really just be that simple.
Let's step back a little. You mentioned Thenics Pro, and I'd love to get into that. We talked about the Waffle House experiment a few weeks ago, and that kind of launched the whole Thenics Pro experiment. Do you want to tell us about the Waffle House experiment?
Well, yeah, I think you were actually the one who told me about it, and it was a really interesting idea because what the way this started with Thenics Pro is, first it originally started as part design exercise, but also part testing keywords. So I was looking around on some keyword, like App Store keyword tools, and I ran into a keyword, which I'm not going to share here because I think it's really critical for the business, but I ran into a keyword that I was like, oh, this looks like this is something that we could target. And so I wanted to set up an app just to test if that keyword would drive traffic before investing further. And when I mentioned that to you, you had mentioned the Waffle House experiment, which, as I understand it, is the guy or the CEO of Waffle House or the founder of Waffle House, which is like this 24/7 diner that's predominantly in the southeast of the United States. And it's like an institution, man. Like, we could talk a lot about Waffle House. But it's famous for like 3 a.m., like Tuesday 3 a.m. fights is the thing it's most famous for.
Let's talk about the Waffle House experiment. So, as I've heard it, the founder had a strategy for identifying if a location was good for a new franchisee Waffle House. And his strategy wasn't to pay some consulting firm to analyze the area. You could imagine looking up how many homes are in the serviceable region, how many competitors are there, etc. All these like really standard consultant practices you might expect and you might pay $50,000 to $100,000 for a report on. Nah, he throws all that out the door. What he does is he drives to the potential site of the Waffle House at 3 a.m. and he just counts the cars driving by. And that's the whole experiment. And I find it just so brilliant because you're just cutting out all the bullshit. You're not asking why this Waffle House might be successful and then working backwards from that. You're just saying, well, what's the top of the funnel? And you're just going and you're measuring the top of the funnel. So I remember you talking to me about the keyword, which we won't name here, and saying, okay, I want to build an app just to see how much traffic there might be on this keyword. And to me, that just screamed the Waffle House experiment. So I think we might need to refine it a little, especially because I think Thenics Pro has evolved into a much more fully fledged app.
It's evolved to a much more fully fledged app.
But I think it still is a bit of that Waffle House experiment. And as you and I both work on these projects more, I think something we can work towards is finding the true minimum viable product.
I know exactly what it is. I found it right at the end.
So
it's interesting. I kicked this off to do the whole Waffle House experiment. What ended up happening though is, because of the way that I'm wired, I wanted to make a really great product. So originally it started with, we're going to set up this app, this minimum app, just to see if people download it, to see if this keyword works, right? So that's where it started. Then I wanted to invest in design because I wanted the App Store screenshots to be really compelling. And then once I invested in the design, then I got really excited about the product and I wanted to design the product. I designed the MVP. It's very close to shipping. If I'm being honest with you, I think it's actually been pretty fast. I think I'm sub 3 weeks at this point. So I'm feeling really good about that. But it did go a little far it actually went very far away from the Waffle House experiment. Like, we've already built the Waffle House. We've already started serving omelets, right? We've done our launch week almost. We can talk about that later. It's been a little bit hairy, but what I found out at the very end was that you can put something on the App Store in a pre-order stage. And when you put it in pre-order, it's visible on the App Store and it starts ranking for ASO and people can start pre-ordering it. So if I was going to do this all over again, the Waffle House experiment would be maybe 5 screenshots, an App Store name and description, do all of the ASO, and then put it on the store in a pre-order status. Because then it starts ranking. You can see how strong the keywords are in terms of how many pre-orders it's getting. And you can start to really gauge the top of funnel using just the pre-order system.
Yeah. I'm curious. We ought to try that in parallel too, because it sounds super lightweight. just how much of a top of funnel you get in the pre-order state. Like, does Apple have a different ranking system if it's in pre-order, so on and so on? I think the biggest value here too is also going to be comparative. So if you've got, say, 10 different keywords you're considering mining for an app for revenue, you can launch 10 pre-orders. And even if each pre-order doesn't do that well, that still gives you a comparative metric to see, okay, which among these 10 is the strongest? And then you just double down on that and then cancel the others.
Now, one thing that is worth mentioning here is that you do actually have to have a complete App Store review. So whatever you put in the actual app has to be enough for a reviewer to give you the thumbs up. But honestly, it could probably be as simple as in my case, it could have been a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. These are the things you're going to do. And you tap on it and there's like a little dialogue that explains what the actual exercises are.
Yep. Yeah, I'm excited to see how this goes. I mean, you have been accidentally live for a couple days now, right?
Yeah, I can talk about that too. So I ran into a problem with the pre-order system, which is I had set the pre-order for the 8th. So that would have been yesterday, Monday. But I had it set to manual release. And if you looked at the actual App Store listing, it would say this app is in pre-order and it would say expected on the 8th, right? So it very clearly said like expected on the 8th. It wasn't making a promise on the date. And so I thought that the date that we had set was just like a way to communicate to users what the expected launch date was. But what ended up happening is Apple actually released, and they didn't even release on the 8th. For me, they released at around noon on the day before, on the 7th. And my guess on that is that it just has to do with time zones. So because we had the app available worldwide, I think it just fired it out whenever the first time zone was.
Yeah, it probably asked you somewhere and you just missed in the form that it was asking what time zone and it defaulted to God knows what.
I'll have to look at it again because I'm definitely going to do a pre-order on the next app, but I'll have to look at it again. But that was the one thing I will say to people is just, if you do a pre-order, just go through and just double check everything to make sure that it looks okay, because I was surprised by that. Now, what ended up happening was actually a little bit of a shit show, but not horrible at the same time. So what ended up happening is it went out live, the build wasn't ready, but worse than that, the back end wasn't ready. So what I found out later is that we were using Firestore and we hadn't actually put the production rules in Firestore. So when people went through the onboarding process, none of that data got saved. So they were able to create an account, which means I did get their emails if I want to re-engage them. The pre-order funnel did clear. So I don't have the exact stats right now, but I think something like 100 people have already tried to use the app in the first couple days. I was able to get the back end fixed. So now people's data is actually being saved on the back end, and people have actually started paying for the thing, which is pretty wild. I don't know if it's Patreon effect or people who are coming from the App Store getting excited about it. But when you get into the app, it does show you what your workouts are. It does show all the different muscle progressions because this is for calisthenics. So instead of like increasing weights, what you do is you increase like reps per set, and then you go from like a kneeling push-up to a full push-up to like a narrow push-up and then a wide push-up and then an archer push-up. So that's how you kind of like increase your weight, so to speak. And so they're able to see all those progressions, but the actual experience of, saving your best set so that we can automatically level you, like the whole magic of the app is just like not working, right? That's only working on my local. And then on top of that, because yesterday was the eclipse, my entire day was booked. And so it went out a day early. And then the day that I would have had to actually fix it, in the morning, I spent the morning trying to get as many things fixed as possible. And then the rest of the day, I went to do the eclipse and then woke up today. And today we're gonna tie things up and ship it. But yeah, so a bit of a bummer that the funnel got cleared. I noticed that there was a problem as soon as people started tagging me on Twitter saying that they couldn't get through onboarding. And I just had to tell them that, the thing went out 48 hours before it was supposed to. And so far, everyone's been pretty understanding. But yeah, so we'll just kind of see what happens after this.
Do you have like revenue or DAO targets you're hoping to hit to say, okay, this is a good place for a Waffle House?
I don't have any specified right now. My core purpose right now is to just get the basic experience out today so that people can go in and use the thing as intended with no extra bells and whistles. And then I'm just going to kind of look at the numbers and look at some of my other apps and try to set targets. But you know me, I'm not a huge goal person. I'm more of like growth goals, right?
Yeah.
So can we grow this, or is it just like staying stagnant essentially?
Yeah, yeah. To step back a little to the earlier topic on income, etc., do you have a sense of where ramen profitable is for you?
5K MRR is what my ramen profitable is.
Gotcha. And if you hit that, do you think you're going to stay indie, or are you still going to hit that like 6 to 12 months and say, okay, I'm going back to a regular job just now with supplemental income?
I think after that, it depends on if it looks like there's growth or not. Like obviously 5K MRR is like the minimum, right? 5K MRR is like, okay, I don't actually have to work for somebody else if I don't want to. But there's some very real benefits of being an employee. First of all, your books get much simpler because you don't have to worry about buying things like healthcare for the United States or dental care, stuff like that. It's kind of a minor detail. It's really not a huge deal once you're making money. You know, you can figure that stuff out and it's not the end of the world, but it does kind of simplify your life a little bit. The other thing too is the social aspect. So like I feel really blessed that, you know, you and I talk a lot and I have other people in the community that I talk to regularly. So I do have like some of that social contact in work to like make sure that I'm not just personally staying stagnant. So not just the business, but like me, myself. So there's all kinds of reasons to be an employee outside of actual income.
Do you feel like you get that social part if you're working remote, though?
It's hard for me to say because my whole career has been remote. So I do get it to some degree. I think what I would say is that my experience working at Tonal remote was that I was working with a lot of people who are just very, very capable. And so when people around you are very capable and running at like a fast pace, like you kind of have to keep up. And so you lose that, I would say.
Yeah, I think the thing that's really getting to me in my current indie project is I find other people depending on me, like, hey, you need to get this task done because you're blocking me, or we need to get this done together because it's important to me, to be a huge motivating factor. And I do have a partner on my current Dribble project, but for his own personal life reasons, he's involved, but not at a very significant level, which is super understandable. But at the same time, I'm finding that's really burning me out. So I really see that. And I kind of like partner indie projects. Of course, that gets so complicated once you have two people because it gets, okay, now you have conflicting interests, conflicting lifestyle needs, like where I am now. But there's just something super, super motivating about having an indie project partner that depends on you and you depend on them, that really just keeps you both running so fast.
Yeah, like I think the conversations that you and I have serve that purpose, you know, for me. Yeah. And also shout out to Dane Mackier. I have conversations with him too, and a lot of them kind of fit this need as well. The other thing I will say is that when I'm talking about, Dane is awesome. But when I'm thinking about the future, right? What is my ideal end state? So what I would like to do is figure out how to consistently build 10K MRR businesses. I like mobile apps, right? Consumer mobile apps. But I would like to be able to set aside 6 months. And I know that this is like, you'd have to be at the top of your game to be able to do this. So I'm not like pretending that it's easy. But set aside 6 months, be able to build a 10K MRR mobile app, and then be able to have a small portfolio. So let's say 3 or 4 of these, like constantly running. And then when it comes time to build the next one, I just sell the one of those 4 that I'm, less interested in. Yeah. And then go build the next one. So I constantly have 3 like growing and bringing in income, and then 1 gets sold and I build, and I use that money to essentially build the next one.
Yeah. It's kind of Kirkland brand Nikita Beer. You know his story?
Sure.
Yeah. And his most recent viral app was called Gas, and it was big like 2 years ago. And the famous story from My First Million is he called his shot. I believe it was 10 mil. I'm not sure. You guys ought to check me on that. But he said, he gave himself a really tight time box and said, in this amount of time, I'm going to make 10 mil revenue.
Yeah.
And then he gave himself as much planning time as he wanted. But once planning time was done, the clock started and he made 10 mil revenue. So I could see you doing the exact same thing, except we're kind of playing in a slightly lower league here and just trying to hit 10K MRR. But to be fair, 10K MRR...
It's like the little league version of that. There is one thing about that strategy which I think is interesting, which is the infinite planning stage. I think is interesting because you can get so much done that's really important in a planning stage, and the actual execution of that doesn't actually have to be that long. And I used to see this in the agency world all the time, where somebody would, on their own, like a client would do the planning stage with a designer on their own. They might take 6 months, they might take a year to do it. Then they'd come to us, they'd show us the designs, they would say, can you build this? And we'd be like, great. And we'd knock the thing out in like a month, right? So that ratio of planning to execution, like totally makes sense to me, honestly.
Yeah. I think also the Waffle House framing, I keep coming back to that. I think that is really a good metaphor to keep hopping back to just take a bunch of stabs at figuring out what that cycle looks like and getting good at the cycle instead of getting good at any individual attempt at it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that probably puts us at time. Is there anything you want to close on here?
The only thing I'd say is I'll just do like a shameless plug. So Thenics Pro is a calisthenics mobile app. That's the one that we've been talking about. You can find it at thenics.pro.com. The concept here is, there's a lot of ways to just get fit, improve your general fitness, body composition, and all that stuff. But I've always found that bodyweight exercises are my personal favorite way to do it. There's the obvious things like you can do them at home. The only equipment that you might ever need to buy is a set of gym rings. They're like $50 and you can just hang them off of like a tree or off like your basement rafters or something like that. So super accessible. But for me, as I am getting, I'm not super old. I'm 35 years old, but I have problems with my knees, and I found the bodyweight fitness to be just the best way to get in shape and feel really good about myself.
What keyword do we want people to install Thenics Pro from? Because if we give them a specific keyword...
So the easiest one, so Thenics Pro, searching Thenics Pro is the easiest way to find it. But if you want to help with App Store optimization, then if you type in calisthenics and scroll down, at this point, I think it's ranked 150, but we can get that up pretty high. So if you want to do us a solid, then search for calisthenics and scroll down and install it. And that'll help us with rankings.
Awesome. Thanks. Let's hope we see a bunch of people driving by Calisthenics Pro and installing.